an aspect of that that really is important is military to military. We don't have an agreement on that yet because, again, we both agree that we want to, at the very least, make sure that we don't inadvertently have a conflict because of miscommunication.
We've got a fight in our hands. And my question to you is simple. Are you with me in this fight?
What we need as a party and as a country is a president who will go big, lead America to big achievements and big goals again.
Hello, everyone. I'm Caitlin Huey-Burns in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken met with Chinese President Xi Jinping during a high-stakes trip to Beijing. The U.S.'s top diplomat says that both sides agreed to, quote, stabilize ties. CBS News chief foreign affairs correspondent and Face the Nation moderator Margaret Brennan is traveling with the Secretary of State and spoke with him in Beijing. Margaret?
Caitlin, Secretary Blinken came to Beijing with the intent of diffusing the risk of a potential military conflict. And while there were no major breakthroughs, U.S. diplomats left with a sense of progress that at least now the two superpowers are talking. And before leaving Beijing, Secretary Blinken sat down with me and went through a number of the issues between the two countries, including the flow of fentanyl from here in China across the U.S. border, as well as spying, that listening post in Cuba. Take a listen. Your message has consistently been that you are here to open up lines of communication to avoid a military clash. But you just said China did not agree to open that military to military line of talks. Did Xi Jinping just say no?
It's a work in progress. This is something that we need to do in the interests of both of our countries. That is, not only to establish and reestablish and strengthen lines of communication across our government, which we have done, starting with this trip, and I believe visits to follow by a number of my colleagues, and then Chinese officials coming to the United States. Hugely important if we're going to responsibly manage the relationship, if we're going to communicate clearly and try to avoid the competition that we have veering into conflict. But an aspect of that that really is important is military to military. We don't have an agreement on that yet. It's something we're going to keep working. I made very clear to our Chinese counterparts the importance that we attach to that, something that is also profoundly in their interest, because again, we both agree that we want to, at the very least, make sure that we don't inadvertently have a conflict because of miscommunication, because of misunderstanding.
So Xi Jinping didn't say absolutely not. It was just not a commitment.
This is a work in progress. We're working on it.
Will the defense chiefs at least talk to each other?
Well, again, to be seen. We've made clear that we think that's important, more than important, imperative. I think the Chinese understand very well, because I made very clear where we're coming from on this, and we'll keep working it.
During the Cold War, the U.S. and the Soviet Union had that hotline. Is that the kind of thing you're imagining? How would this kind of communication work?
It's less a hotline and more regular engagement, regular communication, so that they understand what we're doing and not doing. We understand what they're doing and not doing. We have greater clarity on each other's intent in different places. And in particular, when we have incidents like the incidents that we just had a couple of weeks ago, with them driving their boats much too close to ours, or their planes flying in very dangerous ways near ours, that we have a channel established that we can go to deal with the problem.
But that architecture just doesn't exist right now.
Well, we of course have many ways to communicate with the Chinese government. It's exactly what we're doing, and we're seeing that now pick up, in part as a result of this trip. It's fundamentally in our interest to do that. But one aspect that remains is the military to military, and we'll keep pressing it.
The other thing that you really emphasized was the need to talk about fentanyl, which is killing Americans.
That's right.
Do you believe that the Chinese state can really turn that up and turn that down?
Yes. Yes. We need to see much greater cooperation when it comes to fentanyl. We've seen some of that in the past. In fact, a few years ago, China actually scheduled fentanyl, put it on a prohibited list. And one result of that was that actually manufactured fentanyl that had been coming to the United States from China, that pretty much went to zero. What's happened since, though, is that the chemicals that can be used to make fentanyl, the so-called precursors, those have been moving liberally to primarily to Mexico, where it gets turned into fentanyl and then winds up in the United States. So part of the challenge is making sure that chemical manufacturers that are producing these precursors in China, and then in some cases inadvertently sending it to the wrong people in Mexico or other places, sometimes intentionally, deliberately, that's what's got to stop. I made very clear to China that this is an area where we want and need to see real cooperation. As you said, this is a crisis for us. The #1 killer of Americans aged 18 to 49, fentanyl. So the best way to deal effectively with this problem across the board, we're working, of course, on dealing with demand in the United States. We're dealing with law enforcement with Mexico. We're dealing with putting technology on our borders to detect fentanyl and other synthetic opioids. But we also want to go to the source, and that is these precursor chemicals. I believe this is an area where the United States and China can and must work together. It's not about pointing fingers. It's simply finding a way to cooperate.
I've had lawmakers in the U.S. say that this is done intentionally by the Chinese state. Do you believe that?
So all I can tell you is this. We've seen cooperation from them in the past, and that's made a difference. That halted more or less over the last few years. They have issues that they've raised to try to explain why they're not doing as much as they can.
Did you raise the listening post in Cuba that was recently disclosed and we've talked about?
I did. I'm not going to characterize their response, but I told them that this is a serious concern for us. And
how widespread is this in Latin?
So we've been taking steps over the past couple of years, diplomatically, wherever we've seen China trying to create that kind of presence. We've been in there pushing back against it, and we've had some success in doing that. This is nothing new, but it is something of real concern. I was very clear about our concerns with China, but regardless of that, we've been going around to various places where we see this kind of activity, trying to put a stop to it.
Did you get any commitment on those 3 wrongfully detained Americans?
We have a commitment to continue to work hard on resolving these cases, and for me, that's right up there.
From the Chinese government?
Yes. From me, that is job #1 when it comes to looking out for the security and the safety of Americans abroad, and notably those who are being arbitrarily detained.
Mark Swedan's health, in particular, is a worry. His mother has spoken to CBS and other news organizations.
Yes, I'm deeply concerned about that, and that's exactly why I not only raised but talked some length about the individual cases of the detained Americans.
Are we in a place, though, as 2 governments where you're negotiating or even talking about a prisoner release, or is this just...
Yes, we are.
You are?
We are.
And there's progress?
Again, I don't want to get into the details, but we are very actively talking about that.
Well, that would certainly be a breakthrough in the relationship to bring those Americans home.
It would, regardless of anything else, be a very important and positive development, and we're working it intensely.
All of this carefully orchestrated diplomacy happens against the backdrop of a Congress that is putting political pressure on the president to take a harder lined stance. So that's political risk is just one of the many other factors that needs to be balanced here. And this is a very challenging relationship. All of the diplomacy that may happen in the coming weeks and months with other high-level visits like the Treasury Secretary who is expected to come to Beijing soon, it may all ultimately be building up to a face-to-face between President Biden and President Xi. Secretary Blinken told me that could indeed happen as soon as this fall. Caitlin?
A fascinating and important interview. Margaret Brennan, thank you. And President Biden is in California on a major fundraising swing through the deep blue state. We head there next for the latest in his re-election bid. You're streaming America Decides.
The investment we've made in these past 3 years have the power to transform this country for the next 5 decades. We've got a fight in our hands. And my question to you is simple. Are you with me in this fight?
He's ready to finish the job. He's ready to win. And with your help, he will.
And welcome back to America Decides. President Biden's re-election campaign is kicking into high gear as he rallied with union workers in Philadelphia over the weekend. And this afternoon, Biden is speaking in East Palo Alto, California, where he announced over $600 million in climate investments to help fight climate change.
We're investing in the people and places that have been hit the hardest, but who are also on the front lines of leading us forward. Throughout our history, we're the only nation in the world that has come out of every crisis we've entered stronger than we went into it. We're doing it again here in the climate crisis.
And CBS News Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes, who is traveling with the president, joins us now from San Francisco. Hey, Nancy, good to see you over on the West Coast. So President Biden's fundraising in California today as well, in addition to that speech that we just heard. Can you walk us through what he has on his schedule? How big of an appearance is this?
Sure. He's really doing a lot of fundraising here with a side order of public appearances. Really, at this stage in the campaign, what's most important for the Biden campaign is raising a lot of money and raising it fast. So he's got a couple of fundraisers in Silicon Valley today, a couple more here in the San Francisco area tomorrow. These are being hosted by big tech heavy hitters, executives from Microsoft, the co-founder of LinkedIn, Reid Hoffman, those types of bold-faced names. And then he's also going to be giving a speech here in San Francisco before heading back to Washington, D.C. This is all part of a big push in the second half of June, where you've got not just the president, but also the vice president, the second gentleman, and the first lady, all traveling the country, holding major fundraisers where they can bring in a couple million at a pop over the second half of June. Because he doesn't have any major Democratic opponents. So really right now, the campaign believes that his time is best spent not going out and holding big rallies, but going around hat in hand asking for money.
A lot of money to be had in California, especially. Speaking of the campaign, how is the Biden campaign feeling at this point? We had a CBS News poll earlier this month that this number kind of stood out to me, that 42% of Democrats don't think the president should be running for re-election. 58% say that he should be running, but that 42% is still a sizable chunk. Is this something that the campaign is concerned about? And kind of how are they feeling about that at this stage?
So they sort of write that off at this stage as Democratic angst, and they argue this is the kind of thing that Democratic voters are famous for. What about this? What about that? We're not sure he's the right person. They argue at the end of the day, these voters are all going to coalesce around Biden because he will be the nominee for re-election. And they point to his bid a couple of years ago, the first time around, and note that there were Democratic voters who were interested in all these various candidates. Once he became the nominee, the party rallied around him. And they argue it's not unusual this far out from Election Day for voters to be sort of, hopeful that perhaps there might be somebody younger, somebody fresher, somebody different. But they believe at the end of the day, those voters will come home and support him.
Democratic angst is something we hear a lot about in this lead up. I'm curious, too, kind of how Biden and his team have been responding to what should be something that would be, a huge moment, obviously, in the campaign, which is the indictment of your chief rival, Donald Trump. I know the First Lady and Biden campaigned in Philadelphia over the weekend, and they offered some criticisms of the Republican field. But how is Biden kind of addressing this issue specifically?
He's really not addressing it head on. He has made an oblique joke or two, sort of referencing the indictment in not so many words, sort of showing that he's kind of, he's in the know, but he doesn't want to talk about it. In fact, he tries not to say Donald Trump's name at all. He did a rally in Philadelphia. You played a clip of it this weekend, and he was speaking to union members, and he said, my predecessor. He didn't say Donald Trump, and he didn't talk about the indictment. He talked about infrastructure, which is an issue that that crowd and people all over the country care about a lot. And he said under his predecessor, infrastructure was a punchline, and he's going to make it a 10-year headline because of all the infrastructure spending that he has gotten passed. So he's at this point really looking to create that kind of contrast to say that Donald Trump wasn't able to get things done and that he has gotten them done, more so than going after Trump's indictments or his legal woes, which really gets him sort of down in the dirt with Trump, which is something that he doesn't want to do, at least not right now.
Yeah, and to that point, Nancy, I mean, when you talk to Democrats in the White House and the campaign, do they still assume that Donald Trump will be their opponent in the fall, or are they starting to kind of take a look at some of these other candidates?
Look, I think they have to prepare for the possibility that some dark horse will emerge. You always have to worry about that, but certainly they look at the same polls we do, and they see the unbelievably commanding lead that Donald Trump has in those polls right now. And so you have to assume, as they are, that he is the odds-on favorite in the Republican Party. Now, will Republicans suddenly get skittish because of the 2 indictments he's already facing and more possibly to come? Sure. So they are drawing up plans to take on any number of Republicans, but the biggest playbook that they've got right now does have to do with Donald Trump, because he is just leading his closest rivals by 20, 30, 40 points. And so at this point, yes, he does look like he is in a commanding lead in the Republican field.
And speaking of former presidents, former President Obama has kind of been starting to put himself out there and weigh in on the Republican field a little bit. He's clashed with presidential candidates like Tim Scott, who's kind of used it, honestly, as a badge of honor, and Nikki Haley a little bit. Do we have any idea of kind of what role he is planning to play in 2024? Is this kind of more of what we might see?
Well, this is interesting because he's certainly lobbying some criticism that the current president probably couldn't. He was doing a podcast with one of his former senior advisors, David Axelrod, and he criticized Tim Scott and Nikki Haley, two notably minority candidates who are running for president in the Republican Party. And he said that while their messages about race in America are hopeful, that there is a history of minority candidates in the Republican Party kind of glossing over, in his words, the history of racial injustice in this country. And he said that they're not addressing crippling generational poverty resulting from hundreds of years of racism. And so this was very interesting to have the nation's first black president making this case about a couple of minority candidates. And as you would imagine, both Tim Scott and Nikki Haley responded. Scott said that he's actually an example of progress for African Americans. And Nikki Haley argued that former President Obama was turning minorities into victims. So an interesting conversation taking place there, and a sign that the former president isn't going to shy away from making pointed criticisms from the sidelines in this campaign.
Yeah, and an opportunity for those candidates also to fundraise off of those comments. So we'll see kind of how that all plays out. Much more to come. Nancy Cordes in California, thank you so much, as always.
You're welcome.
And now that the former president has been arraigned on federal charges, how are the other Republican 2024 candidates talking about it on the campaign trail? Well, we'll catch you up on the latest when we come back. You're streaming America Decides. And welcome back to America Decides. The 2024 presidential candidates were out on the campaign trail and in the press over the weekend after last week's historic arraignment of former President Trump in Miami. For more, CBS News political director Fin Gomez joins me now, fresh off reporting in Miami. Welcome back to Washington. Before we get to the Republican field, I know you have some new reporting on Biden. We were just talking about this with Nancy a little bit. But, you know, he has been pretty tepid in terms of going after Trump on the indictment. What's kind of the strategy there? Have you been talking to Democrats about, do they want to see more from him?
I have been talking to Democrats, some top Democrats actually, connected to his campaign, and also some of those from his core constituency, if you will, and that's his the labor unions, and they frankly say that that they want to see more engagement. They want to. He has been silent. They want to see more from the president. The strategy about being above the fray is not a winning strategy. They tell me we're not going to be distracted by the bully, and that strategy is what happened in 2016. They say, and they want to see a pugilist right now. They want to, right now this is the issue that the Democratic voters are talking about. And they want to see the president more engaged because they feel that if he remains silent, former President Donald Trump sets the narrative. And it is echoes. There are echoes of 2016 if that happens. And they want to see their president engaged.
And that's interesting, too, because Labor just had the big endorsement of Biden over the weekend, and he's trying to seize that momentum. Switching gears a little bit, former Attorney General Bill Barr was on Face the Nation yesterday. And our Robert Costa, our colleague, talked to him a little bit about Trump and kind of what kind of risk he would be. Fascinating interview. Let's play a little bit of it and talk about it on the other side.
He's like a defiant 9-year-old kid who's always pushing the glass toward the edge of the table, defying his parents to stop him from doing it. It's a means of self-assertion and exerting his dominance over other people. And he's a very petty individual who will always put his interests ahead of the country's, his personal gratification of his ego.
Okay, so some really tough words from his former attorney general. But you're not hearing Republicans say what Barr's saying, with the exception of Chris Christie. How are Republicans kind of navigating all of this?
You mentioned the word tepid. I think that would be an accurate one to use in this setting as well, because we haven't heard that much from his primary competitors, right? There's been the dial has moved up slightly, if you will, with some criticism towards the former president after this indictment news, and there's been talk of Pence said there were serious allegations. There's been talk but there's been more talk of perhaps like pardoning him if he were convicted, like from Nikki Haley, from Vivek Ramaswamy, from others. So, but why are we not seeing that, Caitlin? And I spoke to a senior Trump official who said that it's a political calculation, they believe, that they can't go after the former president because if they do, they risk losing 50% of Republican voters. He is the most popular figure in that party right now. And for them, they believe it's a political calculation. However, this is a race. Are we going to be seeing some contrast between these rivals? I think you almost have to, perhaps, if you do want to set a tone and tenor to set your campaign as we go forward in this cycle. Yeah, because you would imagine as someone competing for the Republican nomination, if the leader of the pack has a federal indictment, you would imagine that would be an opening. But to your point, that's interesting how the Trump campaign is seeing this, because our own polling showed 72% of Republican voters believed that this was all political more than anything else. Right, and they're letting essentially Chris Christie be that having that space, being the attack dog, if you will. And they see Christie as almost on a quote suicide mission because he, what is his path outside of New Hampshire? Many are asking, and I think they're allowing that to happen and again having this political calculus that they can gain if perhaps these indictments and these investigations become more significant and affect the trajectory of the race. Yeah, and so on that note, I mean, Chris Christie has been asked about whether he'd sign this debate pledge to support the eventual nominee, and he said he would essentially take it as seriously as Donald Trump did in 2016. How are Republicans kind of navigating that? Is that really an issue here? I mean, it seems like there's not much the RNC can do about it. It's more of an issue for those who may not hit that criteria, right, for the debate stage. That's 40,000 unique donors. It can be $1 essentially, and also if they get net more than 1% over national and early state polling, that it's recognized by the RNC. However, Asa Hutchinson, Chris Christie, they've been critical of that pledge. Asa Hutchinson, for one, has said, how can I endorse if he gets convicted? How can I endorse a convicted felon? But will it have an impact? I mean, the biggest impact, as you mentioned, Caitlin, is if Donald Trump shows up at these debates. I was there in Iowa in 2016. Yeah. He did not show up at that debate. So Christie has a point. Will Donald Trump show up regardless of the pledge or not? At all. Right? And that would certainly change Christie's calculus there. Yeah, something that we might have to wait till August to figure out. Finn Gomez, thank you very much. Good to see you, as always.
And now that the former president has been arraigned on federal charges, how are the other Republican 2024 candidates talking about it on the campaign trail? Well, we'll catch you up on the latest when we come back. You're streaming America Decides.